ordinary case in which an individual is asserting that a state statute limits her ability to express certain content on the grounds that her expression would disrupt the moral sensibilities of a community. Maybe she wins, maybe she loses, but the court's inquiry will focus less on the status and structure of the government's power to protect the public's morals and more on whether she has a fundamental First Amendment right that is being compromised by the state regulation. You can conjure up 1,000 hypotheticals of constitutional conflict, and you will find that most of the focus will be on the right, not on the power. This situation was not nearly as common in much earlier eras, when the courts were less intently preoccupied with questions of fundamental rights and tiers of review, and more on whether the government had the power to act in the first place. Well, those provocative words are from the introduction to Good Governing the Police Power in the American States. And we are lucky enough to have the author of that book here today on Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Thursday, March 6, 2025. And this is another in our series of Now for Something Completely Different. Instead of doing the day-to-day problems of the Federal Courts of Appeals, we're going to take a little bit of a longer view about this thing called the police power, which many of you, even non-lawyers, may have heard of. But what exactly the police power is a great question that not a lot of people have good answers to. We deal with it all the time at the Institute for Justice in our cases. But it gets lost, especially these days, when you read judicial opinions and you listen to commentators. So we have someone who has actually dug into this issue and tried to figure it out. He is Daniel B. Rodriguez. He is the Harold Washington Professor of Law at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. He's a former dean of that law school. He's had all kinds of other fancy academic appointments. He's written all kinds of things. But more important than all of that, I can say he has been a great help to me in my career. And for what I've heard from the grapevine is he's been a great help and inspiration to many other young scholars and lawyers in their careers. And so I'm so happy to have him on the podcast. So Dan, welcome.
Thank you. Much too generous introduction, but I appreciate it nonetheless. And very, very happy to be here.
Well, great. Well, Dan and us at IJ kind of came in contact about 10 years ago now, because he joined us for a symposium we had about economic liberty and state constitutions. And Dan is a foremost of all kinds of things, a scholar on state constitutions. And so he wrote an article for an edition of the NYU Journal of Law and Liberty, came to the conference we had there. And that paper was on the police power. So my first question, before we get into your book and reasons for it and why people would be interested in it, I just questioned, did IJ take a tiny bit of credit in launching you into this project of the police power and your interest in it, or are your interest in the scope of the police power goes way further back than that?
No, I choose option A. I think more than a tiny bit of credit. I should also give a shout out, in addition, of course, to IJ and the folks who put that together in the journal, the great Richard Epstein, who you may recall was a conspicuous part of that symposium at all. So all of that combined, I hope it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I've been a big fan of the work of the Institute for Justice going way back. And, I've thought about state constitutions and written some about state constitutions also going way back. And so the kind of the focus in on the police power that culminated in this book it comes from a variety of sources. But as is so often the case, the occasion to be able to sharpen some of those ideas at that symposium, which I remember well, was actually important in thinking about these issues.
Well, great. And your book, we'll dig into now. And so I appreciate those kinds of works about IJ as well. Listeners who are usually listeners of us are fans of IJ in some way or another. We have the hardcore libertarian types and the softies and everything in between. Some of you will agree with a lot of Dan's books. Some of you will disagree. But what you will find and I found from reading it is that it is wide ranging and makes you think about a lot of things in a new way. So I'd like to start things out with this book, but which, by the way, I love this part about it. You can get it for free from not Columbia, sorry, Cambridge
Yeah.
University
Yeah.
Press. Yeah, from their site. We'll put a link in the show notes to it, or you can buy it. If you're an old fashioned, you like the hard copy, the paperback, you can get it from Amazon or wherever. So we'll put links in the show notes for that. But your book, I was surprised how wide ranging it was and how many topics you address, but that's kind of inevitable if you're trying to get your hands around this thing called the police power. So tell us, what's the police power?
Well, the police power, before getting to that question, guilty as charged. The book became more and more unwieldy as digging into this issue, just as you say, implicates a whole wide variety of issues. And obviously we can talk about it, but let me come back to the core question. The police power is the power of the government. And here we're really focused on the state government, to regulate health, safety, and welfare. Maybe we might put morals into that as well, since you use that as a good anecdote at the beginning. So the power to regulate health, safety, morals, and the general welfare, sometimes called the common good, which is a power given to state governments under state constitutions.
So I want to get into some of the real philosophical, historical roots on the police power, but something that's kind of just really core to the story and central to the story is this change that you describe over the course of American history from the police power being the prevention of harm to anticipating future harm, or really just regulating for the common good, for lack of a better description. Tell us a bit about how that process works, and then maybe from today's standpoint, how we should think about that.
Sure. So here's an example of the analysis becoming maybe unwieldy and broader than just this doctrinal focus on the police power. So long story very short, we see the evolution of the common law, and here we want to actually go back even before the founding period to Blackstone and the old greats, right? As a process, to oversimplify, in which the law works mostly through private law to basically accomplish what's called the sic uteri principle, right? So you think of a nuisance, right, law as basically reflecting the idea that you can use your property, freely, except insofar as it comes into conflict with others' use of their property, and many, many analogs and throughout tort law and contract law and all of that. Now it takes on a public law valence, and this is the police power is critical to this story at the time of the founding and throughout the 19th century and all, as governments actually pass legislation. State legislatures do, and local governments pass legislation. And again, the original idea or ideas still saw the role and function of the government in enacting that legislation as essentially being the public law mechanism to protect individuals' liberty, to safeguard folks' rights, as it were, against threats by the use of other folks' property and all of that. But as we saw with the evolving role of the state, and I guess this is about as philosophical as I get in the book, as we see in the evolving role of the state, of course, the functions of the state, and I'm using the state in the grandiose sense, but also in the specific sense of the 50 states, take on a broader remit, as it were. And so just as generally the common law morphs into, to a great extent, public law and legislative law, so too the police power takes on, others have written about this as well, a wider function. And to throw some more Latin at it, it takes on what has been called a salus populi idea, is the government is acting to promote the general welfare, which goes above and beyond the function of the government to just protect individuals' liberties and rights against others. So it becomes, you mentioned you have a lot of libertarian listeners, so they'll appreciate this. It shifts from a more libertarian conception of the role of the law, deeply embedded in the common law, to a more small p progressive conception of the state and state power. And the police power is both the fulcrum of that. It generates some of that change, but it also is brought along, as it were,
Right.
with that in important respects. And there's not. Let me just say, there's not one date in which that happens. There's not one case that reflects that. Sometimes, and I take a deep dive into a lot of these cases. It's not one episode or event. It's not Munn versus Illinois, for example, where the transition happens all of a sudden. It happens over the course of many years and many decades, and indeed, it's still happening as measured by the case law and the thinking about the role of the state and the role of law.
And so going back to the really early stage of what you were just talking about, of states regulating maybe to protect rights, maybe a little bit about protecting for the common good in the early republic, that of course went on, prior to the revolution. Parliament passed laws back then regulating all kinds of things. The City of London, you look at some of Cook's cases, passed laws to do all kinds of things, some of which were appreciated, some of which weren't.
After the Great Fire, after 1666,
sure.
To be more precise, a whole range of local government, that saw there to be, protections of individuals and all that. Yeah.
So what is, I guess, what in terms of the early republic and then later on, what is different about, say, the American experience? And maybe it's the obvious, right? But I'm going to ask it this way. What is different about the American experience and then states regulating with this thing they call the police power, with their new, Republican, Democratic, call you what you want system, versus the old idea of either Parliament regulating or just, what governments since, 2000 BC have done to try to provide for the public welfare?
Yeah. So you ask a core question. I should begin with the caveat. I'm not a professional legal historian. There are historians who are better trained, as it were, and better focused on answering those very big questions. But I take my shot.
Okay. Yeah. And you have good disclaimer in the book. Like, this is not legal history, but we got to go.
It's not legal history,
but
unavoidably there's a historical picture. There are a couple thoughts. One is the development of state constitutions, which, as you well know, you in particular well know, because you've written, of course, so wonderfully about this, predates the founding of the the U.S. Constitution in important respects, the founding documents, postdates the founding, and so it's that too is an evolution. But state constitutions reflect, as the U.S. Constitution did as well, the notion of popular sovereignty. And the we the people, the big we the people of the 50 states, but also individual states are acting in the name of the people in important respects. Power is derived from, and the authority of the state is derived very much from the consent of the people. So there's a very social, public consent, social contractarian notion of the role of government, and that's an American contribution. It's a contribution that owes homage to English constitutionalism and all of that, but is something new and something really, really important. So that's one thing that's different. Another is, and again, not to bang the drum about libertarianism too much, but I will say this, is in our American founding, we were significantly preoccupied, and I think rightly so, on the need to balance the imperatives of government action and government regulation, infrastructure, dealing with fiscal issues and all of that, with the profound importance of protecting individual liberty and individual property. So property rights and the protection and the regulation of property is a through line throughout this book, and I think any serious analysis of the police power. And that, again, didn't begin with the founding of the American Republic, but those are distinct American contributions. And distinct, as many folks who've written about this have pointed out, those are contributions that persist in the founding period, throughout the 19th century, throughout the 20th century, and into the 21st century, right? Of how we balance this tension between protecting property, but also important ways in restricting and regulating the use of property.
And so, moving along there, this is a good point you make in the book, and it's embedded within that opening quote that I read, is when we talk about when people, judges especially, but commentators, whoever, would talk about the police power I don't know what date, but just throw out 150 years ago would be a time where this happens. They talk about the police power being expansive, but having certain limits, and would not necessarily talk about, say, the due process clause or other provisions of your state constitution, your federal constitution, the contracts clause, whatever it was. I actually fell into a trap in this in early in my career in some scholarship where I'd read, say, an old case from even as late as like the 1940s or 50s, and it would say this law is not within the police power. And I would score that up as a due process case because, oh, they're doing substantive due process. Even after, 1937, they were doing this. But it's not really, it's just the police power. And that is something that we just don't talk about today, is that there's limits on the police power that's not when you're just interpreting provisions in the Bill of Rights. So talk a bit about that history, and maybe is that a bit of a glorified thought of the past? Like, am I projecting some kind of small government valiance on what actually happened, or
Not at all. I think the
was it
summary's an
really
excellent one.
different?
It is very different. There's some OGs in this space, meaning that folks who more than 100 years, you say 150 years ago, that's actually pretty good dart at the dartboard. I mean, as it were, it's about 150 years ago. Folks really wrote much more descriptively, and I think analytically sophisticated about police power and the internal limits on the exercise of that power. And let me be more specific. Thomas Cooley, in writing, his great treatise, wrote several great treatises, but in the latter part of the 19th century, Ernst Freund, who wrote a book, your listeners won't be able to see my hand signals, but really thick book,
Yeah,
a big
it's
book
big.
called The Police Power. And so did state courts that never really touched on individual rights in any significant degree. Or if they did, the analysis of, say, due process and equal protection, free speech wasn't even serious,
Right.
so righted that part, was peripheral to the fundamental question of whether or not the state constitutions had properly delegated these powers to state and local governments to exercise. And indeed, Freund's treatise that I mentioned on the police power was largely taken up with the articulation through focus on many state cases of what I call in the book internal limits on that were to be imposed by courts through a sophisticated use of doctrine on reasonableness of regulations, on whether the government had gone too far, whether the government regulation was the product of animus, all of those issues. So just to give you one example of a case that got an enormous amount of renaissance during the COVID pandemic, and that's Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which
Right.
you've heard of in 1905, decided, what is it, the same week or the same month as Lochner?
Yeah, just a few
Interesting
weeks before.
Fun fact, right?
The three judges voted for the majority in either case. Is it fun fact? I
Right.
like.
Yeah. So really interesting. But the great Justice Harlan in Jacobson makes clear that yes, the challenge to the vaccine requirement in Massachusetts was styled largely as a due process challenge. Why shouldn't I be able to get some process and all of that? But the court batted away that argument pretty famously. But in batting it away, didn't lose the key point, which is there will always be a tension between a wide scope of governmental power to act to protect health, which Cambridge, Massachusetts has done in this case, but also the obligation that they act in a way that is reasonable, given all of those circumstances. And that got lost. That got lost to a great extent over the next 100+ years. We can talk about why it got lost, but let me just now acknowledge that now you said you described your error. I don't think it's so much an error, but it's just a way we think about the role of the police power now is, the government can do what it wants if we're just focused on the power. Now get me to the right issue, meaning the rights. Do I have a right to be protected against all of that? And that wasn't the way it was back in the day.
Yeah. And I hadn't really thought about it in this way till now, but there's a lot of focus these days about natural law, which you just wrote about for the University of Missouri, Kansas City. We'll put a link to that new article that Dan has too. But also on, the positivist turn in law. And the way you describe that, it really sounds like maybe what happened was everyone got more positivist, as in you need to see the law written down for it to have some sense. And so it kind of makes sense. Well, the government has this power that we have in the state constitutions, federal constitution. Then there's these things called rights. And so that's the obvious border, because otherwise it wouldn't be law, which of course
Right.
is at the founding didn't make any sense.
No, no, and let me also say, I think you characterize it well, but in saying in this positivist turn, in basically expecting that law to have valence, it has to be sort of written down. Also is a sort of an overshooting. So if you think of, again, some of the cases that your organization and others are litigating, where they invoke, and sometimes successfully and persuasively, due process, and look at, the Lockean sort of natural rights roots of due process and equality norms and property rights. Very important development, historically well grounded. Also articulates this notion that rights are central and essential to protect property and liberty. Absolutely. But let's not forget the yin and the yang of this. That is, those the origins and the fundamentals of those rights protections grow out of strong views that go back to the framing, sometimes even before then, and continue on about the proper role of government and the appropriate scope of administration. One of the, I don't know how interested most readers of this book, which is largely about constitutional law and constitutional theory, would be interested in this, but I bring also to the table, a professional lifetime of focus on administrative law, mostly federal administrative law, to be sure, but also to a great extent state administrative law. And if you're immersed in the world of administrative law, the notion that you will put an obligation on a government bureau or agency to act in a way that is in accord with the facts, that's reasonable, that withstands what folks call a hard look. Not because the agency lacks the constitutional power to act necessarily, but because we have an obligation on the government to provide some decently persuasive reasons. That's the bread and butter of administrative law. But why that is so sidelined when we're considering key questions of constitutional power is a real mystery. It's as though we just imagine, administrative law followed that track where we courts put the onus on the government to come up with good reasons for acting. But when they're doing constitutional review, we're Thayerians. We don't really require much by way of reasons. That's judicial overbearing intervention or things like that. Why?
Right.
I mean, they come from the same origins. The notion of public law, and of course, folks wrote about this 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. The notion that the state, as it were, has an obligation that is subject to limits, internal limits, not just external limits, is fundamentally part of the administrative law that developed from the time that we saw the first agencies. So simultaneously would be my argument. So too, the notion that there should be there should be constraints. Let me not jump to judicial constraints necessarily, but constraints of various sorts, structural constraints, rights constraints to be sure, but also internal constraints is a product, you might say a quid pro quo, for allowing the government this awesome power, police power at all, to act. And I think that point gets neglected in a lot of the conversation about kind of the role of constraints on the exercise of the police power. Sorry, that was a big soapbox moment.
No, that was great. Well, that leads me into something more specific that I wanted to ask about. So one area that our listeners will be familiar with from past episodes where we've discussed this is zoning. And zoning is an area where you particularly kind of dive in a little deep, both about its origins with the Euclid case in 1926 and how it really did seem to be something different with the police power than it had gone on before, but then also with this kind of reawakening of skepticism about zoning, this cross-ideological skepticism we've had the last few years. How why in particular did you, I guess a way to ask you about that is, why in particular did you single out zoning as doing a bit more of a deep dive, and how was it different than maybe your run of the mill regulations on health and safety that had preceded it?
Yeah, it's this of course would take another book. Whether I'm the right author of that book, leave to one side, and maybe many more. But it's not tangential to the point. I think you're right. I'm really fascinated by zoning. So, a couple thoughts. One is the kind of the lodestar case, of course, is Euclid, and Euclid, kind of to the surprise of many, Justice Sutherland of all people writes his opinion
Right.
in Euclid that basically gives the imprimatur on the government to engage in this extraordinary exercise of land use authority power. It withstands the Lochner era in an important way, right? It's not sort of touched by that, and really it remains untouched to the present. This enormous power delegated to state and local governments to regulate the use of private property, and it's I ask this as somewhat of a rhetorical question, although I undertake some answers to it, is why does that movement encounter so little legal resistance, and evolution in some ways over time? Now, it's a little bit of an off-the-wall theory I suppose, but one explanation is the rise of regulatory takings jurisprudence, about which, as you can tell, I'm very grumpy in the book, right? Why did we develop this regulatory takings as basically the focal point of land use regulation? That's kind of a mistaken road, and we're paying the price for that mistaken road. Years and years and years. Folks from the left and the right seem maybe to converge on that point. But the other point, and to finally get to why the zoning is so important now, is remember the power of zoning, the power to zone rests on this idea that, well, the government is regulating public health and safety and the general welfare, and this is the power to engage in fairly robust zoning power is an illustration of that. Now what we know, it's a little hubristic to say that, but I think now what we know is that zoning regulations can have extraordinary unintended consequences. I think there's an economic literature and all of that, and I suspect I'm preaching a bit to the choir here. But we see the misuse and the mistakes with respect to zoning, and here's where I want to yoke it connected to the police power. So we see the exercise of zoning power is not only not promoting safety and the general welfare, but in some respects, is undermining the general welfare, or at least an argument can be made that it is. And to the extent that lawyers are now engaged in, with the help of a growing body of economic literature, to attack land use decisions, sometimes in court, sometimes in legislatures, all of that, the YIMBY movement, and all of that being a piece of that, we see the police power being used as a weapon, and indeed maybe a good weapon, to maybe paradoxically attack the use of zoning power, just as it was post-Euclid used as a weapon to undergird the zoning power. And I think that's why that tension will play itself out over the course of many years in many different domains. I have my views. Obviously, you see them. I wear them on my sleeve about some of those zoning regulations. But even if one's more agnostic about it, I think the attention drawn to the police power to answer those issues are really centrally important. One other just footnote, if I may, is here's another illustration of the preoccupation with rights is keeps us too focused on that, is the invocation of a right to housing, or the invocation of a right to free speech. You think about the nude dancing cases and the adult entertainment cases, or this evolution of, I think, what I view as sort of a mistaken route, which is a right to affordable housing. All of that is a distraction. It misses the elemental point that the debate about land use and property regulation should really be located in discussions and debates about the power of government to act and the responsibility of the government to act in a reasonable way, rather than on the playing field of your eminent domain regulatory takings, or on individual right and all of that. And I think that anyway, I'm going on about that, but yeah, I'm very interested in the zoning part of it.
Well, and that the way you describe the zoning, which I think is a very apt description of why people are more skeptical today, and maybe increasingly some judges out there are going to be skeptical of it,
Right.
Although not quite yet at federal level, but we'll see. Um, that seems to be because people broadly speaking, have changed their views on the policy, right? They've seen, oh, this is actually bad policy, really
Right.
bad policy in some ways, which is right. Is that not supposed to be what we always hear, not supposed to be what you're dealing with when you're talking about constitutional challenges, right? Courts say, we don't deal with the policy. We just look at the Constitution and then we apply that here. But of course, in the background, it always helps. But that could be true of all kinds of governmental sets of governmental regulations. So occupational licensing, I know, is one where you also have sympathies of what we do here at IJ. But
Absolutely.
There's many others, right? There's ones where many of us might disagree, like say environmental regulations or some workplace safety regulations or labor laws, right? And so is there a possibility that we could go down the kind of the reasonableness road, like you were just talking about zoning, or are a lot of people going to be freaked out by that because they'll say, well, if we start subjecting, say, the minimum wage as it's actually practiced to reasonableness, it might not hold up, right? And so it's like this box that we often hear from our progressive friends who are like, oh, we love the work you do on occupational licensing, but man, if I was a judge, I don't think I'd want to open that box because we'll get Lochner tomorrow, which I think is ridiculous. But say what you can about those worries and how maybe the police power is a way that can assuage them.
So there are real worries. The trite phrase, I give two hands of cheers, or what's the expression?
Two cheers for
two cheers. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Is maybe apt in this respect. I think that the proverbial slippery slope is worrisome. I was taught in law school. I'm older than you, but you were presumably taught in law school to, fear the new Lochner, and Lochner was seen as, this is what happens. Don't resuscitate. Right. In the First Amendment, I don't want to get off too much on a tangent, but one of the fancy phrases that's used a lot in the scholarly literature is the Lochnerization of the First Amendment. It's like the worst thing you can say, right, about First Amendment jurisprudence is it's like the new sort of Lochner.
And we hear that all the time with our occupational speech cases.
Exactly. So, but indeed the fears are real given the concern we have. I certainly share this concern that, widespread judicial intervention could lead to, the courts engaging in kind of means and scrutiny where they have more of a roving, attention to whether this is good or bad policy. And that puts a lot of regulations that we take for granted in jeopardy. And it also gives a wide discretion to the court, wider than I would feel comfortable with. Now, but we need not to get to that parade of horribles. And again, as we talked about several minutes ago, we do have historical experience with the courts engaging in evaluations of the reasonableness of regulation that does not need to necessarily go off the rails. We, by the way, have that experience also with the federal courts. Let's not forget that notwithstanding Williamson versus Lee Optical and rational basis review and the kind of the death of economic liberties as an important component part in equal protection cases. Think of Justice Kennedy's opinions in, where to start? Ever versus Rome versus Evans, Lawrence versus Texas, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, things like that. The government or the Supreme Court has been looking at issues of animus, right, as a basis too. So we can thread that needle with some attention. But let me make a larger point, which is rather than dwell entirely on what the court should or should not do, there can and ought to be some significant structural limitations on the exercise of the police power. So, COVID brought with it, COVID pandemic, a lot of new attention on the police power, right? A lot of these gubernatorial and legislative orders were being challenged as well. The government was going beyond the scope of the police power. And again, they were often invoking rights, and most of those cases failed. The cases that this is a taking, this is a equality norm, whatever. But in some of the cases, the courts tackled the questions, and I think in a sensible way, of whether the principal problem with some of the exercise of these powers were that it was too much of a delegation. So they invoked, at the state level, the non-delegation doctrine, or it violated the separation of powers. Now, I think these were hard cases, and I by no means am suggesting that, I agreed with what Michigan did or what some of the other states did, but they were asking the right question. They were asking not the question of whether you have an individual right to not wear a mask, or whether a business has a property right in being able to be open rather than be shut down. Those were doomed to be sort of losers for the most part, for a variety of reasons.
Right.
But asking the question of whether structurally it made sense to give governors, through executive order, sort of unchecked power to impose these regulations and then impose them again and then impose them after another 60 days, really raised some fundamental questions about whether and to what extent there should be structural limits on the powers. So to come back to the point, there you can have a courts playing a role without engaging in sort of neo-Lochnerism by looking at sort of structural issues and structural constraints. And I'll make one last point, because I know this has been a long screed, and that is some of the role should be the role of politics. Should be, the legislature can constrain governmental action in important ways, and so can state local authorities. So it doesn't always have to be the courts that are that mind the store, as it were, with respect to a lot of these issues.
Well, that's a good point. We like to say at the Center for Judicial Engagement, of course, that legislatures have other incentives that unfortunately they have to deal with. But you're right. At a fundamental level, they should be thinking about the powers that they have and whether they should delegate them. I think that brings up a question. You talk a bit in the book, and we don't probably talk enough here on Short Circuit about the democratic element of this. So you talk in the book about some work that scholars have done recently about imbalances in democracy in states. So legislature, gerrymandering is the most obvious case of that, but there's
Sure.
all kinds of examples of, where is the most, quote, democratic aspect of the state government? Is it in the legislature? Is it the governor? Is it the local level? You have split executives in most states, of course. How does that play into thinking about the police power? And one part of that I'd love your thoughts on is we often hear, if you really want to engage in democracy and stop governmental tyranny, you should go to your city hall, because your city is actually, your little town is the one that has much more power over what you actually do with yourself and your property than what happens in Washington, D.C. But of course, your local government is the one that most people have no clue what's going on there. How does that play into both the police power and then how a court should think about these issues when a law comes before them, whether it's a local ordinance, whether it's a state statute, whether it's a federal statute?
So I think there's a legal dimension to that, and there's maybe a socio-political, cultural dimension, to use a lot of words on it. I think one of the important legal elements of that stems from American constitutional federalism, and the fact that we leave, and I think rightly so, to the states the fundamental choices about how to structure their systems of democracy. Not completely. So we have one person, one vote, and many the Voting Rights Acts, and of course federal law that deals with a lot of those issues. But take something that you mentioned, you alluded to, like the plural executive, the fact that our executive officers at the state level are elected sort of separately by and large. That's really not the business of the federal government. That's left to the states. And some, my view is some states strike the right kind of balance. Other states strike the wrong kind of balance. The structure of the legislature. We have in the United States, the diversity of our states, where we have, New Hampshire It's like a member of the lower house can sort of know all of their constituents because it's a gigantic legislature. California state senate, is way too small. So I think that I'm more hesitant than some scholars have been to make a kind of a full-throated attack on the kind of the democracy deficit or the lack of democracy at the state level. I think there's much more diversity and much more work that's done at the states to try to strike that balance. And thanks to the progressive era, I have to say that. I hope your readers don't hang up having heard me use that phrase. But thanks to the progressive era, we have a lot of state constitutional reform. We have requirements of balanced budgets, line item veto, et cetera. So more democracy than meets the eye, and thanks to federalism. To your sociocultural political point that you raised, absolutely, huzzah, I'd say, to your point about more engagement with the engines and the levers of governance by local citizens is absolutely essential. So City Hall, et cetera. One of the big threats to the utilization and private property, which is I think underappreciated by a lot of fancy legal scholars, is the rise of special purpose governments and special districts, which are so prevalent and so important, deal with a whole range of property issues. I'd be curious on another offline to talk to you about how IJ is thinking about some of these issues.
We are,
in their own litigation strategy. I bet somewhat. So my point is, we leave it to states to make the choice to delegate certain authority to black boxes, as it were, to governments that don't have the same accountability to individuals. And I think that leaves citizens somewhat asleep at the switch. And I think some engagement with how governmental choices are made. We're going to have robust disagreement, right? That's democracy. But how these choices are made will be really important. And it's related to the topic of the book because our comfort level with the broad exercise of the police power to protect health, safety, and welfare, to tackle these wicked problems, is directly tied to our comfort level with the institutions of government and how effectively democratic they are acting or not acting, not only in terms of structure, but in actual decision making on the ground.
Right. What so we talked about zoning, but what are some other areas of regulation, for lack of a better word, that you see as where things might be changing, or where you see opportunities, or you see perils, perhaps, in the future in the police power?
Well, occupational licensing, which you mentioned, is very much on my mind, and even more specifically, occupational licensing in the legal profession.
Yes.
So I think that we're going through a period, and IJ is very much a part of this, working with other organizations that, shall we say, maybe not be your usual partners, right? Some might say strange bedfellows, if you'll permit me that, are working together to deal with what is a profound access to justice crisis. There's no way to sugarcoat it, and nor should we see that as just accidental or being purely an economic problem. It's a problem that stems from the hardcore guild of the legal profession, and it goes back decades and decades. It is manifest in some really awful decisions from or indeed neglect as well from state bar authorities acting in self-interest, from the American Bar Association, which I wish I had kinder things to say about it, having been a card-carrying member for so long, and other organizations. And so that occupational licensing racket, as it were, is interfering in very significant ways with access to justice. And so, having identified the problem, and many have identified that problem, I think the use of legal strategies to tackle that is really, really important. So what does this have to do with the police power? Well, the police power, along with kind of the, other constitutional doctrines and the independence of the judiciary and all of that, have combined to historically to give the government enormous wide berth in terms of engaging in occupational licensing. Now, IJ's done some work striking down some of that, parts of the citadel in many respects, and we'll see how successful you all will be in tackling that, the legal guild, maybe the most resistant of all. But it is, I think, a misguided use of the police power to see much of our occupational licensing as part of protecting the general welfare, when actually it is, as the access to justice crisis indicates, undermining the general welfare in some really important respects. So I think it's a full court press that we'll see. Some will involve the role of the courts, litigation ongoing, as you know, been part of that. Some will be legislative action, which will reflect a really big, titanic, I think, shift from, well, the courts deal with this, the judiciary deals with issues involving the bar, legislature's just going to be on the sideline, and certainly the federal government's not going to have a big role. That's going through some significant changes. And I'll engage in a little bit of fantastical thinking here in saying I think the change will come from an alliance from both ends of the political spectrum, as well as the middle, that see that we're not being served by the structure of occupational licensing in the United States. And in particular, we're not being served by occupational licensing that really protects guilds and incumbents against intrusions.
So one almost an anecdote on that is, and we talked about this the last time we had an author on, Rebecca Allensworth, who just wrote the Legacy
from Vanderbilt. Yeah, she's great.
Bracket, right? And but we've seen this also in our own work, that one justification for a lot of occupational licenses by the members of the profession who helped enact the law is that it promotes professionalism, or it makes the people who have the license kind of more included in the economy, think better of their jobs than they would if it was an unregulated profession. And when I think back to the classic mantra of the police power triad, or whatever you want to call it, health, safety, welfare, and we can leave morals out. Welfare, when you think what is general welfare, I don't think of someone feeling better about their job because they're a professional, because they now can call themselves a professional. But welfare really is this English word that just has so much meaning you can pack within it. Was that kind of like a tragic flaw at the beginning of the police power, that it had this general welfare and that could be just shaped however we wanted it? Or is it, could there have been along the way, and maybe there should be now, describing the police power in a different way than just to promote the common good? Because anyone can twist the common good to whatever they want.
Well, so here maybe there's some daylight between our views. I think you're too much of a cynic. I think that yes, I mean, general welfare, the common good, has capaciousness to it in the way it's phrased. But let's not imagine that it's impossible to find content in it. And when we find content in those phrases, find sources of limitation. So Munn versus Illinois, and cases at that, in that era, post-Reconstruction era, talked about regulation on businesses affected with the public interest. It didn't take all that long for folks to say, oh, well, businesses affected with the public interest, how can that be a source of limitations? That's basically anything and everything under the sun. But it didn't follow a fortiori from the court saying the public interest, that it basically means the government can do whatever it wants. The first regulatory statutes, the Interstate Commerce Act, that talked about regulating, in the public interest, the Federal Trade Commission Act prohibiting unfair trade practices. We have to be rather cynical to basically say, we all know that Congress meant you could do whatever you want under the sun. So I don't think we went awry because from the beginning, because they used general welfare and should have used a more narrow clause or formulation. I think we went awry when, at least under the rubric of constitutional law, particularly the rise of the rational basis review, that became essentially a get out of jail free card for the government to operate. Now, don't hear me say that I think we should, in pouring content into that, engage in, again, the renaissance of, strict means and scrutiny, where where constitutional review becomes a referendum on deciding whether the judge agrees or doesn't agree with that particular policy. But we should struggle. It's a good struggle to figure out how best to promote the common good. And by the way, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, there's also been an enormous, fascinating renaissance with the notion of common good. Adrian Vermeule has written, this highly controversial but really interesting, he's both of those things at once, book about common good constitutionalism that's got a lot of attention. It frightens the bejesus out of a lot of folks, its agenda and its objectives and all of that. But I think he's asking the right questions, as other folks are as well, is fundamentally we should think about constitutionalism as promoting the common good. The question is, to whom should it fall to define what is the common good and to struggle over the contents of that particular common good. And so we can certainly do that, and and ought to, consistent with the origins of the police power. It is not a get out of jail free card for the government to basically say they have the power to promote the general welfare.
So we've kept you here for some time, but before we close, any other areas or issues you think readers would want to be aware of coming into your book, or something you want to take from your book and move to the next project, whether that's scholarly or more in the real world?
Well, I love that question because I can do some publicity.
All right.
At the very last two chapters, and even the last chapter, which is the shorter chapter, one might see it as kind of tacked on to the end, and I don't mean it as such. I raised the question of, okay, this is a book about regulation and how we think about regulation. The police power is a fulcrum regulation, but it's not just about the constitutional authority to regulate this amount, that amount. It's also what techniques and tactics we use. And I think we what sometimes, on our posts of doing constitutional theory and all of that, we forget that in the real world, the government and also quasi-government associations are engaging in the development of new forms of regulation and regulatory techniques. Folks have written about behavioral nudges, or the use of the taxing authority to engage in regulation, or the move from command to control to other techniques. And I do have a contract for a next book, also with Cambridge, that is about frontier regulations, basically about how we think about regulation dealing with issues on the frontier, AI,
Sure.
public health emergencies, cryptocurrency, opioids, and things like that. And so it's basically, the topic is, okay, now we have this menu of new wicked problems, things that are developments because of new technology or new ways of confronting significant social problems. We have old ways of regulating, some of which have worked, some of which have spectacularly failed, some of which introduce some difficult legal dynamics. Aren't we, and when I say we, I mean around the world, not just limited to the United States, aren't we at a time now where we really can experiment with different regulatory forms, regulatory techniques, and regulatory strategies, again, under the discipline and under the rubric of our constitutional authority and the limitations made? And how might we think about these different regulatory strategies on the frontier? So less a work about constitutional theory, although constitutional theory informs it. I'm still a card-carrying law professor after all, and more about reimagining new forms of regulation. So stay tuned.
Okay.
Have me back. Let's talk about that topic.
Well, we'll plan on it. And in the meantime, I should add, if you should all go and download or buy, if you want to give Dan a little bit of residuals, Good Governing, The Police Power in the American States. We'll put a link in the show notes to it. You will stay tuned for the next book as well. If you have questions, or if you think this book is so interesting, you'd like Dan to talk to your local group about it, you can reach out to him. We'll put his contact info in the show notes.
Please do that. Yeah.
And this is a conversation I've been wanting to have for some time. So I'm so glad that we are able to do it. So thanks for coming on today. And for the listeners, please be sure to follow Short Circuit on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other podcast platforms. And remember to get engaged.